following content is provided by MIT OpenCourseWare under a Creative Commons license. Additional information about our license and MIT OpenCourseWare in general is available at ocw.mit.edu.
Today is the last meeting of our class on the nature of creativity, and what I wanted to do were several things. First, I wanted to try to pull together the various threads that we've been investigating. Second, I wanted to continue with a little presentation of my own about creativity in the Western world, and which is related to what we were talking about last time, creativity in science and technology. But mainly, I'm eager to hear your ideas about the material of the course and the course itself, together with what you have in mind for the final paper, which is theoretically due today, but for which I told you all you could have an extension. And so what I would like you to do is to take over and talk about what you care about, which is relevant to the course, particularly in relation to the paper that you're going to turn into a masterpiece when it's handed in a few days. Okay? Any question of that sort or business that you want to attend to now? Let me start then in reminding you that the course started out with ideas of mine that I hope, and that you contributed to. In fact, I'll say ideas of mine, but throughout, but each week you all contributed a great deal toward the subject that I was focusing the week on, and your presentations were very valuable. The first, at the beginning, it was the relationship between the spiritual and the creative, my idea being that Western philosophy in particular has, Western thought, theology, has put the cart before the horse in as much as they thought that there was a spiritual basis to creativity, and consequently human beings could be creative by emulating the spiritual source. As against that, what I argued was it is the creativity in human beings, wherever it comes from, that's to be determined, that gives rise to our ideas of what is spiritual at all. So that the relationship should logically be reversed. After that, you read my book, Feeling and Imagination, and for the next 3 weeks we discussed different aspects of it, particularly the major chapters on the 4 modes of approach to questions related to creativity, even though none of them is adequate for dealing with the nature of creativity itself. It was the point of development in myself. I couldn't carry out that mission as well as I would have liked to, and still would like to, that is dealing directly, frontally with creativity. But I saw these as different subsidiary categories that are relevant to that kind of question. One of them was imagination, the second is idealization, the third is consummation, and the fourth is the aesthetic. All of these I wanted to investigate because they were humanistic modes of thinking. Science has done very little with them, and it's interesting in the contemporary debates about brain science and the relationship between body and mind. Very little is said, for instance, in Minsky's book that we got to later, I'll get to shortly, The Emotion Machine. There's not much that I found very fruitful on those subjects. Why? Because these are subjects that somehow have evaded the scientific net. Too hard for science to deal with the precision and the kind of replication that defines the nature of science, and yet native to the humanities. And I got to them myself because I am a humanist. My training is in aesthetics and humanities generally. But that seemed to me now to be the thing that cognitive studies ought to be able to harmonize itself with. It's not a substitute for cognitive studies or brain science or any area of the sciences, and yet it seems to me to be a new approach, given the way the history of ideas has gone in recent years, that supplements the cognitive approach. And the challenge now for all of us, particularly at MIT, is to find a way of harmonizing the two. I emphasize MIT because from its very beginnings as a university, which dates back to just after the Second World War, as a university, the ideal has been to harmonize humanities and science. It's an ideal in which science has done its share and become very advanced, and the humanities have not caught up, but the blame is also on part of the scientists who have never known exactly what to do about the humanities. Well, that seemed to me the burden of the book, Feeling and Imagination, as a kind of extended proposal through the analysis of those four categories: imagination, idealization, consummation, and the aesthetic, and especially relevant to any investigation about the nature of creativity. We then went on for 3 weeks discussing chapters in David Bohm's book on creativity, and they were dealt with in parallel with chapters out of the book I'm writing now on the nature of creativity, 2 of those weeks on the creative experience, and the first half of my chapter called The Creative Process. In talking about the creative experience, you remember, I emphasized that the experience itself doesn't explain creativity, even though a great many writers have assumed that. So that Kekulé's dream and Archimedes' eureka experience in the bathtub, getting out of the bathtub, are experiences that are usually used as paradigmatic for the nature of creativity. And what I was arguing was that no, creativity can involve that, and generally does, but it involves so much more that the experience should be given a secondary place after the process, the nature of the creative process. We then turned to the creative process, both parts, the second part overlapping what you were reading about in the anthology Creativity in the Arts, and then I went on to the 2 parts of my chapter called Aesthetic Creativity, which is all about creativity in the arts. After that, I asked you to read a chapter of mine from my book, The Harmony of Nature and Spirit, called Aesthetic Foundations of Ethics and Religion. And we discussed, and I read, we discussed the new chapter of mine called Creativity in Practice. The burden of that being, by taking a particular practical problem, one in the field of medicine that deals with the question of doctor-assisted suicide, from that I opened up the analysis and claimed, as I have elsewhere, that all of ethics is really a function of creativity, that no rules, no fixed principles, whether they're Kantian, a prioristic in terms of reason and respect for the personhood of other people, or utilitarian in terms of the greatest good for the greatest number, none of them are adequate for explaining the actual practice of ethics, how people go about making ethical decisions and acting in ways that other people will consider to be ethical. And the same I claim was true of religion. Now, in the last 2 weeks, we've been dealing with what I call, you will recall in my conclusion to Feeling and Imagination, the religion of science. The idea that science, in principle, should be able to tell us through its rational procedures, its special kind of rationality, the truth about everything, what the world is like. There's a world out there, science investigates it, in principle at least, given enough time, maybe not only in principle, but as a kind of program for the future, given enough decades, centuries, millennia, eons, nobody can say, but the hope is, the faith is, that eventually science will put all the pieces of the puzzle together, jigsaw puzzle together, and then that future generation will know the truth about everything, right? Incidentally, I forgot to mention something that comes into other writings of mine about the Hitchhiker's
Guide to the Galaxy.
What to the Galaxy?
Guide
to the Galaxy, right. You remember at the beginning, the wise men ask Deep Mind, is it the name of the computer? Deep Thought? Deep Thought, right. It's a parody on Deep Throat, which something very different. The problem they set him is what is the truth about everything, the meaning of life, the meaning of everything. And after many, many generations, it comes up with an answer for the elders of that time who've handed out ideas about the problem from generation to generation. And its answer is, I don't have to tell you, you all know this, right?
Yeah.
Chaz?
It's 42.
42, exactly. That's the exact right answer. And the old men are angry and say, you mean all these centuries we've been waiting to get the answer and that's the best you can do? And the computer says, well, I checked it very carefully, and they're still annoyed. And the computer says, well, possibly you don't understand what the question is. And I think that's the most brilliant thing a computer could say. The crucial thing is to understand the question. That's the beginning of wisdom. That's what philosophy is really interested in. The giving of the answers, even if they purport to be scientific, can be derived. But the ability to understand the question, that takes genius. That, I think, is the highest creativity. In any event, the present faith that I started this little distraction on is that through brain studies, through cognitive studies, through the magnificent complex that MIT has now constructed, in principle, we should get to a point where all of these questions, all of the questions about life and about the world we live in, about our reality, the reality, because what other one is there that, apart from the one we know, will be solvable. And I think of that as a faith. And that was the argument of the conclusion to Feeling and Imagination. It's not that I'm opposed to people who have faith, whatever the faith is, but it's merely a faith. And if you think that it itself is scientific, then I think that is a mistake that I was arguing against from my humanist philosophical point of view in the last chapter of that book. And I think it applies to the prospect of the new effort at MIT. When I was, this is not an autobiographical divertisement, but it's very relevant. When I was an undergraduate, I had a friend in philosophy at Harvard, and then we both went to graduate school in philosophy at Harvard, and we talked a lot. And the great man at that time was the philosopher and logician W.V. Quine. Have any of you read any of his works? In any event, he died maybe 5 years ago, and the memory of him seems to be fading already. But he was the top of the heap at the time, and had published an essay that we both had questions about, And my first paper was written with him and was published in the Journal of Philosophy when we were still first-year graduate students. And ever after that, we've exchanged, we wrote another paper jointly, and then we've always been exchanging ideas. Now with the internet, we have a very voluminous correspondence back and forth on everything under the sun. He took early retirement from the university, his professorship at the University of Maryland, and moved to Florida, and so we communicate through email mainly. He wrote a book which won a very prestigious award called the Johnsonian Prize, given by the editors of the Journal of Philosophy, and which came out maybe 20 years ago, but is still remembered by analytical philosophers, particularly the ones in my department who work along the lines that he had mapped out very early, long before other people did. The present version of that is what's called Physicalism, which I will explain in a moment. His name is Moreland Perkins, and when I went to the inaugural proceedings at the Pickhour Center last week, I sent him a description of them, and he was interested, so I Xeroxed what I could get, which he could have got too off of the internet, and I sent him a copy of Tech Talk, which had several articles on that in the last issue. We in class at our last meeting, you remember, discussed the comment by one of the speakers, Patricia Churchland, in which she said that ideas of soul, spirit, mind, consciousness are all simply illusions of the brain. Those were her words, quote, illusions of the brain. And that's what I questioned, that I didn't see how that they could be illusions of the brain. They might somehow involve human illusions, but how could the brain have an illusion? That my argument, remember what I said, that it's as if you thought that a hammer could have a headache or be in a state of anxiety. I discussed all that with Moreland Perkins, and he sent me back an email in which he defended that view. And his argument is that what you're missing is that it's not a question merely of causation. It's not a question of whether the brain causes consciousness, which I don't question. I don't know who does question anymore. The question is whether consciousness is constituted by the brain, whether the two are somehow one and the same thing. And gave me a description. I wrote him back saying, in class, several of my bright students in this course held a similar view, though they, of course, couldn't formulate it exactly or as well as you can, because here he is an important philosopher. But it's a similar view to yours. And then I said to him, tell me, if X constitutes Y, what does that mean? What does it mean for X to constitute Y? Because that seemed to be the view that he was defending. I wasn't questioning with him any more than I did with you that the brain causes consciousness, in the sense that unless there is a brain, consciousness would not occur. We could agree about that. But he, and I gather you, though you didn't carry it as far as he was, were arguing that the consciousness is the consciousness is constituted by the brain, or the brain constitutes. No, it has to be the other way. I guess it was the brain constitutes, or it could be either way. A brain constitutes consciousness, or consciousness is constituted by the brain. What does that mean? I want to read to you now his email about that, and we can stop my part of the proceedings today with any kind of discussion about this that you want, but I do want to leave plenty of time for you talking about your papers and your ideas of everything in general. And this is Moreland's reply. In this context, constitutes, is a way of signaling that there is nothing in the universe but physical stuff, processes, events, and properties, i.e., that the mind, consciousness, moments, experience, maybe it should be moments of experience, moments of experience, consciousness, mental events, thoughts, sensations, and so on, are all brain structures. They are brain structures. That's the point. Brain events, brain features, and so on, through however many ways you want to specify that they are nothing but attributes of the human physical body. In other words, this expresses what used to be called a thoroughgoing metaphysical materialism, which is nowadays called physicalism, and which I would guess is the dominant belief about the nature of things among American analytical philosophers concerned with this sort of subject today. Though, of course, I could be wrong about the exact percentage. I personally adopted the physicalistic view in my doctoral thesis, which was the origin of that prize-winning book of his that, incidentally, is called Sensing the World, which was a physicalistic account of chiefly belief and secondarily drive or desire and tertiarily sense perception. Obviously, no one has proved this thesis. It's still an article of faith, if you like, as a kind of projection or prediction of how over time the world will increasingly make itself visible as of this sort. So it's interesting because he talks about it as an article of faith, but it's an article of faith about discoveries that are not themselves articles of faith, but that will give concrete proof, scientific proof, of the thesis of physicalism that he is defending. Next paragraph. However, there are certainly some very sharp and quite hard-headed analytic philosophers concerned with the subject who devote whole books still to showing that physicalism cannot be correct. So if your sentiments are, this is me, you personally, you are not you in general, but me in particular. So if your own sentiments are dualistic or worse, you should feel free to continue to enjoy them with a good conscience. It's a wonderful statement, I think. Now, we can discuss it right now if any of you want to, but thinking about it, I was a little taken aback that I should be accused of being a dualist, because I've never thought of myself in that way. And then it occurred to me, as I was walking over the bridge today thinking about the class, there are three kinds of dualists that one would have to consider. One kind of dualist is the dualist of the traditional sort that in philosophy is supremely represented by René Descartes. Descartes believed that as a metaphysical principle, there are two beings, two substances, one of which is matter, the other of which is mind, and that the two cannot be confused one for the other and cannot be reduced to one another. Now, there are certain virtues for that were capitalized on by Christianity, and Descartes was writing in a Catholic era when he could have got into a lot of trouble if he said things that were radically different. Giordano Bruno, the great Italian philosopher of the previous century, or maybe less than a century from Descartes, was burned at the stake because he said that God and the world are the same. He was a radical pantheist. So I don't think Descartes would have be burned at the stake, but he wanted to be acceptable to the Catholic theology that was the dominant force in French life at that time. I mention that because I can understand why religions would develop out of this attitude. It's a very comforting one. It's one that speaks to the mentality of most people. All of us, I think, whether or not, whatever our religion is, or if we even have a religion, we feel that we as conscious beings, as ourselves, are not reducible simply to our bodies. I, Irving Singer, identify with my consciousness, with my memories, with my experience, with my perception, my being here in front of you, and not to what's happening in my organism, my body, while I'm speaking. I'm not even aware of my digestive system at any time because it acts 24 hours a day without intruding very much into my consciousness. Occasionally does if I have a bellyache, but usually the body is performing its job as something separate from what I am aware of, right? And I wouldn't mind if, when my body dies, which I have every reason to expect, my mind, my consciousness kept on going. Yes, just as a little aside on this, I showed an interview yesterday to my film class with Ingmar Bergman, who had several of whose greatest movies are about religious themes, and whose father was a parson in for the royal court, and he was very troubled because he couldn't accept that faith and felt guilty and miserable. And the movies, as he says, were ways of working out his fear of death and fear of guilt and punishment because of his way of living. In this interview made in his 50s, when he had gone through all of that, he said, you know, I'm happy to think that there is no God. I'm happy to think that when I die, it'll be like somebody turning off a light, and I would be very unhappy if somebody came around and turned it back on and said, you have to go here and there and be punished, and you have guilt, and you have to be cleansed, and all of that. I'm happy to think that this life is the only one. Well, I don't feel that way at all. I understand why he would, because he was so guilt-ridden. I don't feel guilt-ridden. What I want is to be able to go on, even if it's only as a mind. I don't have that faith, but if that were turned out to be the reality, I think I could like it very much more than Ingmar Bergman thinks that he would like it if somebody turned on the light for him. But all of us identify with our minds rather than our bodies. I had a friend who was dying of stomach cancer, and I remember his saying to me, you know, there is in me a tumor as big as a grapefruit. What have I got to do with that? How can I think of that as me? I'm totally different from that. And he knew he was going to kill him, and it did kill him. That's not what I am. Well, Descartes' view about the relationship between mind and body makes sense and could even possibly justify those who have the religious faith that after death the soul goes on and this is a good world with a good God, and one way or another God will take care of it. That's one kind of dualism, and in philosophy it's been the dominant one up until about the 20th century when there was great reaction against it. That's not the kind of dualism that applies to me, because I don't have the metaphysical view that Descartes has and don't espouse his philosophy. There's a second kind of dualism, which is discussed by Minsky in the emotion machine. That dualism argues that everything in the mind is caused by something happening in the brain. And therefore, as Minsky says it in one place, our job in this book is to see how it is possible through what physical processes that we can investigate through artificial intelligence, through brain science, through physical psychology, how we can trace the origin of our mental states to different states of the body. Now, if by origin you mean that there is a causal relationship, I accept that, and but wouldn't have thought of that as being a kind of dualism. Minsky himself offers it as a substitute for what he calls Descartes' theater of the mind, as if it were totally independent of the body. So that kind of dualism is not what is at stake in Moreland Perkins' rebuttal of my views. The third kind, however, is, and it's also represented by Minsky. You remember what I was calling your attention to last time, in which Minsky says that feelings are simply attempts to think about something. So if the body has a problem, which is how to survive under these perilous conditions of somebody pushing you to the edge of a cliff, you're going to have a feeling of fear, of desire to flee, of whatever, but the feeling is related to your thinking, I may be killed, or what should I do to escape? The feeling is itself simply a part of the process of thinking, right? Now that leads directly into the physicalism that Perkins and most philosophers, if he's right, and the people at the symposium presuppose that the mind is simply a part of a physical process. My view is one could just as easily say the opposite, that thinking is often a part of feeling, that it isn't as if we think about how to survive, but also we are endowed with feelings which are therefore just as highly programmed by nature as our ability to think and our the use of the brain for the sake of finding means of survival. We're endowed with these feelings that are useful to us, and that it's the ignoring of that part of the innate program which causes the scientists I've been talking about and people who do cognitive studies to shortchange the importance of phenomena like imagination, idealization, consummation, and aesthetics. We're also programmed with them, and they are not reducible to patterns of cognition, but rather are interwoven with them. They are in some kind of rich process, so that when Minsky says what we're doing here is trying to find the processes by which the body contributes to our feelings, I want to say it's also a question of the processes by which our feelings interact with our thought and with other aspects that scientists can easily investigate. It's just that these are more difficult parts of the program. And so in that sense, I both am a dualist and I'm not. In fact, I don't like that distinction at all. I don't want to reduce mind to body, but I don't think that they are in principle totally independent of each other, at least in principle, as Descartes does, and thinkers and religious people of that sort. Well, there are various other things in Minsky which I was hoping to get to last time, and maybe we can come back to them today, but I think at this point I ought to turn things over to you. In terms of anything that you want to say, in terms of where the discussion was going last time, and above all, and we can start with that if you want, what you're doing in your papers to see how I can be of help to you with them. Do you want to start, Beckett?
With my paper or with a general question?
Well, you also did the Europe for me. Anything of that sort that you think might be of interest to the class and to the subject matter we're discussing? Well,
I have a question I'd like to ask.
Sure.
In response to dualism, that's what I was looking up online. So you got the mind-brain problem, and I would assume you all would agree that we have an intellect that is, I would say, above that of animals. Would you all agree? Okay, so my question is, why is that? Because if you look at the function of the brain among humans and animals, the physiological function between species who have neural cortexes is still the same. So why is it that we are able to this cognitive function and they are not? And even though, and some of these animals have bigger brains than us.
Well,
We assume it's rational. It's because it's rational. It may not be that. It may not be particularly cognitive. It might be emotional or social in nature. That there's something, not logical that we do that other animals don't do.
Are you asking why it is that we can make tools and do something?
Why is it that we have this intellect and they do not?
Well,
Even though the brain function is remarkably, and especially in comparison to chimpanzees, 98% exactly the same.
I think that they've done studies where it's our brains are significantly more complex, more wrinkles or whatever, and so just there's more stuff going on in it than in a chimpanzee.
So one point to bring out is that even a very small change in a gene that regulates the function of, for example, the brain, can make a very big difference. A few mutations in one gene, I don't remember which one anymore, can basically take you from full language skills to being unable to speak, just by a recessive mutation. And it's in a regulator gene of the brain. So it's not... you can see it as the body is so complex that even small changes in some places can have drastic effects.
So, okay, I can buy that.
but
There's also sort of a nature-nurture problem, which is, human infants, for example, are I think the most helpless among primates, at least, if not mammals in general. And it's through the environmental stimulation, through their development and interaction with others in society that really grows. If you take a child and isolate them from that, they grow into something very different than an average person.
Something that is interesting to me is, what would the consequences be of consciousness being an illusion? I mean, if it's an illusion of the brain as we perceive things, what does that mean to us? I mean, what are the consequences of that?
also your questioning from the very start was that we are above the other animals.
I mean, see, that's how
I don't feel that.
Well, see, that's what I said. I was trying to say that carefully. I don't mean above, but at the same time, our cognitive abilities, we possess cognitive abilities that animals do not.
Well, but that seems tautologous because that's the kind of species we are.
That's true, but why is it that we possess these cognitive abilities and they don't?
Might be because of gene mutations, or it might be that some animals simply evolved with that as their goal, so to speak, whereas others did not. And one could then say, was it a good idea? Should they have? if they could only realize what was going to happen, would they have persisted? And if they persisted, maybe it was because they were dumb or evil or somehow distorted, out of touch with the possibilities of life.
But they always had a need to exist. Like, I mean, that was...
No, but the point is all these other species do continue to exist. And sometimes they do very well with their lesser intellects.
That's true, but see, that's the question at hand. Why is it that we developed these cognitive abilities and they didn't?
But then I'm troubled by the meaning of the word why. Why in what sense? It's like saying, why am I here? It's because my parents and so on. Well, they have different parents.
The reason I say this is because different species of primates, through evolution, you can see great similarities. But we are the only species out of the billions on this planet that has this cognitive abilities. Same thing with the cats. Like, all of these cats, I mean, if you want to go by evolution, descended from one cat, which I don't believe, but at the same time, they all possess similar characteristics. There is, yes, they have vastly different abilities in terms of speed, strength, agility, but in terms of primates, if you consider us primates, the way we have developed, we have less fur and we have these cognitive abilities. Why is it that we, out of the hundreds of species or thousands of species, were the only ones to develop that?
But either you're asking for details of evolutionary biology, because the theory of evolution is part of the attempt to give a scientific answer to that question, or else you're using the word why in some more metaphysical or philosophical way. And if it's the latter, I think I then want to open up and say, maybe we should, it's unfortunate. I mean, maybe it would have been so much better if you add up all the goods in this world, all the happiness, pleasure, all the positive things that we ourselves, having evolved the way we have, looking back over everything, value. There may be more suffering than there is well-being. Think of all of the animals that are slaughtered, all the millions and millions of people with these higher intellects who are killed for no good reason except because they belong in the wrong place at the wrong time, with the wrong religion at the wrong time, or their race, or whatever reason. All of this misery that we tend to ignore because it's just too painful to face up to them. In that sense, one could say, why? Why couldn't we just be comfortable like pussycats and domestic dogs? Why do we need this extra intellect? Why? Hamlet has it, and a lot good it's in him. You see, so in that sense, what you're asking now is a value question rather than a scientific one. If it's a scientific one, the answer is given by theories like the theory of evolution. If it's philosophical, then I myself say it could all have been a great big mistake, and that thinkers who said the world was created by a cruel, angry, hateful God may very well be right. There's that much misery in the world that one feels wouldn't exist if we didn't have these big intellects. Or the solution is, yes, maybe that's true, but that's how things are. We came out of galactic dust, and somehow it evolved into one species, ourselves, that then could conquer the world. And in fact, that's the reason why we have the intellects that we do, because it gives us that ability to conquer the world. The insects still, the last word isn't in. The jury is still out, because the insects may eventually take over. But short of that, that explains and why we have our intellect, and one could say it's a pity. Who needed that? Who in the universe needs that? Now, from the point of view of an individual who's interested in his own welfare, and let's say he's an American bourgeois who's been very lucky to have survived as long as he has, and sort of enjoys life, in other words, me, the question doesn't bother me very much. Well, you mean why? Well, I'm happy enough. I just want to live forever. I'm not happy with the idea of giving up all these good things. But that's a different kind of attitude and different kind of question. If it's the kind that you were asking, then we're back to that same problem.
I think the irony is that you're asking a question that requires us to understand our own brains.
Yeah, that was actually, I don't recall who said this statement, but the statement was the brain or the mind is the universe trying to understand itself. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Well, George Bernard Shaw said that the human brain is the attempt on the part of the universe to understand itself. That we, well, you get the idea, that we struggling for knowledge are the universe trying to make sense out of itself.
But it was also in some of David Bohm's writing when I was researching my first paper, with his whole theory of unfolding and the fact that the brain can't possibly actually understand anything because it is as much a part of the order as anything else is.
As it's without us.
Yeah, like, well, just that we are a part of it, and therefore we cannot ever understand ourselves because it's trying. Yeah, it's circular. You know,
Well,
it's the
but
universe trying to understand
my
itself.
view is even more radical, and that is that I have none of the scientific faith that we can eventually understand everything else. But theoretically, yourself as well, because you are the universe. It's not just that we can't understand ourselves. I haven't any faith that we can understand everything about everything else.
So one thing I
Or whether it would be a good idea. Would that make you happy? I don't know.
Yeah.
I think the example of Hamlet is that people who think too much often make themselves miserable, and that the only happy ones are the ones who are very limited.
Wow. One thing I ran across in a book discussing entropy in art was the statement that creativity has a function, and its function is to maintain a balance or homeostasis for a person in response to the destruction caused by entropy around them. What do you guys make of that? Do you think do you think creativity has a function, and that's it's for the individual to respond to the random forces pushing against him or her in life?
It's an interesting idea. Who proposed that?
I don't remember. It's in a book called Entropy in Art. I know that much.
Does it come into your paper?
Possibly. It started out great, and then I didn't like the second half of it.
So you're working on something else?
Related, yes.
Okay.
Rudolph Arnheim?
Possibly.
What did you find, Mika?
Actually, I just found an essay, not a book. Never mind.
Well, it's like 50 pages long. Yeah, it's an essay.
Okay. Rudolph Arnheim.
Arnheim.
Mm-hmm.
He's a very important aesthetician who wrote a great deal, particularly at the beginning, about the aesthetics of film. He's one of the icons of the development of film studies, and I think he died in the 70s or 80s, not too long ago. Rudolph Arnheim. That's very interesting. What's the book itself?
Entropy and Art.
And the essay is Entropy and Art?
Yes.
And he wrote the whole book, or it's an anthology?
It's a 60-page essay that he wrote.
In his own book?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and it looks like the entire thing is online.
Cool.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, well, that's... Anything more you want to say about that?
Well, I just wanted to see what people think of the idea that, what I'm tossing around in my head is that an important part of scientific creativity is personal expression, and that what you're expressing is your worldview, and specific your belief about the nature of the world or the metaphysics of the world. And it seems to me that if you take creativity in that way, then it has a function. That it has a function that matches our intentions or our motivations in life. And, you know, Arnheim would say that function is to keep us balanced in the face of the destructive or disordering influences of the world. And, you know, this is something that I just wanted to throw out, see what people thought of it.
It sort of makes, I can sort of agree with that on a everyday kind of scale. Just like simple problems, like being on the highway and you run out of gas in your car. Mm-hmm. Well, you have to have a creative solution to solve that random event in order to make sense out of it. So on a small scale, I can see that. But in terms of art and beauty, I don't know. So.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me like, from the way you describe it, it sounds like the level at which he's making this argument in sort of a, you know, big, broad, abstract sense of, you know, art helps us feel better about the world around us and whatnot. I don't think that makes a whole lot of sense in terms of an evolutionary perspective. If you take that sort of view of cognitive development and that things evolve, or aspects of cognition evolve to fit some evolutionary need, it makes a lot more sense that creativity would have to do with something a lot simpler, where it's like, you know, pattern recognition, or you know, such more fundamental things like that that would help our species survive. You know, seeing new links between different things.
Well, look, think of it this way: you're having a fight with your girlfriend, and so you go to the movies, and it really is a work of art whose beauty you can perceive, and whose story is meaningful, and you come out having had what John Dewey calls an experience. You remember I discussed that. The aesthetic is having an experience, and you come out, it really is an experience. That might then cure your depression. That might enable you to go out and face the problems of the world and call up your girlfriend and settle your problems.
I mean, I'm not saying though that creative things can't do that. I'm saying that their primary function is something else, and anything along those lines that is derived from it is secondary to its fundamental purpose, which exists.
Is it these other things the primary purpose, or are these the mechanisms by which it works?
So it sounds like you're saying something interesting, which is that you're making a distinction between function in evolutionary terms, and I had sort of been thinking in terms of intention or motivation, which when science does all and well until you start to have to deal with the question of why we do the things that we do and whether we are allowed to have such things as motivation and intention, especially in the scientific description. So,
wait, hang on. Why would you not be allowed to have motivation and intention? Surely that's kind of the basis of why you're doing science.
Well, but the question is, does that fit within a scientific theory? I mean, let's see if I can explain this. It revolves around the question of free will, primarily in terms of taking human behavior down to the lowest level, the most fundamental theory of science, which has its own problems, but trying to reduce things that we claim we do because of emotions or desires down to atoms or quantum mechanics. At that level, you know, previously it was to classical mechanics, where Newton said the world is, I don't know if Newton, the claim was that the world is clockwork, right, and it's deterministic. And that was a real problem for intentionality and free will, because then if you just knew enough, all of human action would be derivable by logic. When you get to quantum mechanics, if you take quantum mechanics as true, then suddenly it's probabilistic, but it's still governed by laws. And so you still don't get the same kind of, I actually am a person and I have emotions that I can take as wholes. Because the claim of science is that no, what you want to phrase as emotions need to be, or are better expressed as laws of quantum mechanics. So they want to replace emotions with quantum mechanics, and at that level, the human intentionality goes away.
I don't think they're trying to replace.
Yeah, I mean, there are many people who don't. There are many people who don't agree with that. So yeah, it's not universal, but it is a real. It is a real. it's reductionism, scientific reductionism in philosophy. So I'm not making it up, but
Yeah,
I agree that
I'm
not
sure
everybody
you're not
goes
making
along
it
with
up, I
that.
just know how to think.
So anyway, the distinction that I was, when I was throwing function, and I actually meant in a intentional sort of way. So it's interesting to then think of it in terms of an evolutionary sense. I don't know whether there's room for both of them at the same time, or what you think about that.
Do you want to go on with your paper?
What did you have?
He's thinking about it.
They both sort of, they can fit together. I mean, they're just different meanings of the same sort of terminology, and that, I mean, it's, I think, a lot of times actually in evolution, things evolve for one purpose and then they get used for another. I mean, kind of what we were talking about earlier, human intelligence in general evolved to help us survive. It didn't evolve for us to say, sit around in a classroom and discuss philosophy. Nevertheless, we use it for that. And so there are those two sort of different types of function.
So then, in that sense, what would be the purpose of intellect?
To help us survive. It's our, survival
But at the
adaptation.
same time, the animals are surviving just as well.
They have different adaptations. Multiple solutions to the same problem of survival.
But the simplest solution tends to be the more right one.
That assumes somebody sitting there designing it, but let's not get into that.
The way human nature seems to be evolving, there'll be more and more people, harder and harder to deal with them, and therefore probably more chaos in political and social structures. And one way of dealing with that is by destroying them in bigger and bigger nuclear explosions. In other words, that the nature, given the intellect we have, given the slowness at which evolution works, there may be no way in which we can ever cope with fundamental problems of a small planet, overpopulated, and with creatures dominating it who have so many antisocial attitudes and feelings. If you take that point of view and then compare the state of animals in the rainforest who are not troubled by human beings, also, and particular species like the bonobos, who are so similar to us, or sort of a variation of chimpanzees, you might say, why be human? Who needs all of this? The bonobos, chimpanzees have many of our aggressive and violent traits, because we share so many genes. But the bonobos, for some reason, have a slightly different program, and they don't fight, they just make love all the time. And they seem to have a very pleasant existence, except when the others kill them for reasons of their own. But if thinking of the state of the species independent of their interaction with one another, one might say how much better it would be to be a bonobo than a human being. And if that's true, then we could start finding other species that one would be better off being.
I mean, that seems to me similar to the claim of the noble savage, who was the primitive state of man that lived in harmony with nature and had a small, tight-knit social group, and lived off the land in sort of the pure natural state that was best for humankind.
Well, there's a confusion in that because we live close to nature. What we do is natural, and it's all a function of natural impulses in us. It's just that the consequences don't conduce to the system of values that we've also acquired, and they don't bring about a kind of brute happiness that everybody would like to have. So it isn't as if the bonobos are closer to nature, it's just that they have a better relationship to nature than we do, both of us being in doing what comes naturally.
But I'm not convinced that the noble savage ever existed. I mean, I think it's a
That's because of the contradiction in the terms. If he's noble, he's not going to be a savage, and if he's a savage, he's not going to be noble. But eliminating all of that romantic verbiage, one might say there are species, we name them, who are better off, and the world would be better off if they were the dominant creatures rather than us. You see? So you get my idea. I don't want to pursue the question about the noble savage, or I encourage you maybe to think beyond that.
Well, it's just a question of, it's somewhat ironic to say the world would be better off with these species in charge, given that it's us making the value decision.
No, that's contradictory. If we make the value decisions, we're already separating ourselves from them and assuming that we have a superiority. I'm saying if you accept our value system of values, and there is a certain degree of agreement about the goodness of happiness, the goodness of being peaceful and getting along with your roommates and so on, you can then say, given those values, there are other species who would do a better job of living up to them if only we didn't have our dominance over those.
But it could be that the whole reason that these species aren't dominant is because of those very traits that make them sort of work well with their environment. They tend to be a little bit more passive, and it's our sort of destructive dominant nature that is the reason we're dominant. And so you can argue theoretically, yeah, it might be better if some other species were in charge, but it's not something that could ever actually occur because of the actual
because the happiness comes from not being in charge.
Yeah, something like that.
Right.
I mean, I also think there's a problem with trying to say what would be better than us, given that we're judging as us. If humans are so flawed that they would be better replaced by something else, then it seems strange to judge what should be replaced. What should replace humans as humans. That might be the flaw in the first place. It could be an inescapable problem.
That may be an interesting insight into the flaw in all morality. Because if you're going to be moral, you have to have a system of values and standards, right? But having them might already disqualify you from living up to them. I think there are lots of flaws of that sort in human nature.
So I don't know. I'm just sort of reluctant to believe that other species are, in fact, better than we are, because the assumption requires us to judge ourselves as so terrible that we would be replaced by them. But in fact, we're not fit to make that judgment in the first place if we are so terrible.
All right. No, I would be willing to yield that generalization I made if it were agreed that there is something radically flawed in our very being. Now that, of course, is the view of a great many religions, that human nature is evil, and that there's the original sin, and therefore the most you can do is to throw yourself at the mercy of a loving God, right? So that there may be a great deal of consensus about that. The question is the idea of flaw. What interpretation you lay upon it, and that doesn't have to be the same as what it is in most religions. In the case of the bonobos or the other animals who seem to have a happier relationship with their own instincts, we may be romanticizing them. There are all sorts of problems they might have that we never know anything about. In fact, I think we know very little about what it is to be another member of another species. We don't know what their minds are. In the insects in a colony where there's a queen and there's that class stratification and the workers do all the work, we don't know how they feel about that. Do they, when they pass each other? Do they nudge them on the elbow and enjoy their company and have or compete to see who can bring the most food to the queen? We have no idea whatsoever what's going on in these other species, particularly the insect species. But it also would be true of underground moles and other animals that we never try to make sense out of. What about your paper?
Okay, so, like I said, I'm kicking around the idea of scientific creativity being a personal expression of what the scientist believes the nature of the world is. So in other words, the metaphysics of the world. One example might be how early mechanics arose from Copernicus to Kepler to Newton, and then sort of in contradiction with Einstein by a statement of God's presence in the universe, and that leading to harmonious relationships between the heavenly bodies. And it was specifically a belief that if God is existent and present in the universe, then the relationships of objects in nature must be harmonious or beautiful or somehow representative of the great nature of God. And, for example, Kepler was in part so pleased with his theory that gave the motions of the planets ellipsoid form because it finally let him put the sun back at the center of the solar system, where at that time the universe, which meant that the sun, which he saw as the center of, or the temple of God in some ways, of the heavenly bodies, was then in its rightful place in the universe. And that was beautiful to him and was something he actually used as, or was an expression of what he believed in his science. And that's something that guided him in creating the science. He was looking for a beautiful relationship between the heavenly bodies. Now, it's balanced by the fact that the relationships have to be in accordance with observation. And so Kepler struggled with the fact that, in fact, the heavenly bodies did not have circular orbits, but were ellipses. But it's kind of interesting to see that when he did finally accept that they were ellipses, there were other beauties that he found to replace them, which is that, suddenly the sun is in the center of the solar system. Einstein kind of threw this out in some ways because he early on accepted the metaphysics of Mach, as in the speed of sound, and who held that the primary origin of knowledge was the senses. And the senses told you nothing about what was in fact there, rather that all you could build your theories off of, or your understanding of nature off of, were empirical measurements, and that they were observer-centered. And this fits nicely in with Einstein's theory of relativity, because what the theory depends upon are the observable clocks and observable rulers that are dependent, or whose measurements change based on where they are in space to the observer. And so in this way, under the notion that the observer's measurements are primary, Einstein undercut the source of harmony in the universe from one God. It became observer-oriented rather than some sort of absolute relationship between the different objects. So I have a few other examples, but that's the basic idea in terms of how your worldview or your metaphysics on the nature of the universe are, in fact, or are what you express when you create a theory.
When you create a theory, but what is the element of creativity in this? What makes one theory more creative than another?
So Kuhn, in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, draws a distinction between extraordinary and normal science, where extraordinary science creates a sort of new paradigm, yeah, that is not commensurable, is not logically connectable perfectly back to the previous paradigm. So going from classical mechanics to quantum mechanics would be a paradigm shift, and
that is
extraordinary science.
And that,
so in extraordinary science, the creativity is exactly the expression of a new metaphysics, a new
a new perspective.
Right.
But is that the meaning of creativity, or is there creativity in normal science?
So in normal science, I think the creativity is different, and I haven't delved into this part as deeply, but the idea I'm playing around with is in fact that what Kuhn calls the normal science is basically problem solving. You have some paradigm, you have a problem that, because you accept the paradigm, you know must be solvable. So therefore, you must solve the problem. And if you don't, it's your failure, not the paradigm's. Now, of course, that breaks down when you actually get to the point where the paradigm really does fail. But if you're working within the paradigm, then you must be able to solve the problem. And I think the creativity there is to find how the structure of the solution fits with the structure of the paradigm. Which in some ways is a design problem. You're looking to, on some level, construct consciously and on some level intuitively understand the correct design that fits the given structure of the theory. What I would sort of throw out there, which may be nonsense, but is that what is beautiful about problem solving is exactly how it fits the metaphysics of the paradigm. So that if it's an expression of the basic perspectives, such as God is the origin of harmony in the heavenly bodies, then that is a beautiful solution in science. Now, that may not be the same aesthetic pleasure or beauty that we brought up earlier in terms of doing lab work, but in terms of a theoretical origin, that would be a possible explanation for what is beautiful in science. You can think it's totally nonsense. You look like you're thinking about something. Is that true? No. Okay.
Shall we go on to another paper? This is the basis of your paper, right?
Yeah. My paper is going to be a subset of that.
How far is it to being complete?
Not far enough. It's too large. I'm going to take a small part of it.
Well, we'll talk about that later on, about when the papers are going to be handed in and just what state they're in. Which way should we go? Eric? Alec, are you ready?
Sure, why not? Okay, so I'm kind of doing kind of like what I talked about last week, where I'm interested in looking at the idea of free will and determinism, and actually I guess we talked about this briefly earlier today, and what the implications are for creativity, where for example, if you look at it in one way in the sort of mind-body problem, if creativity is something that arises out of mind, and mind is something that arises out of the brain, and the brain is governed by physical laws in some deterministic nature, of some deterministic nature rather, then is creativity itself, deterministic? I.e., if you could know everything about all the states of all the particles and everything in the universe and what they were doing at any given moment, you would be able to sort of calculate out all creativity that would happen from that point forward, or sort of back calculate anything that had happened before that. Is creativity truly creative, or is it simply something that follows from physical laws, and its sort of independent nature is an illusion kind of thing?
So there is the question involves a paradox. Maybe it's a paradox that If something is really creative, then it's not creative because it carries out those laws, right?
Right. I mean,
So the question is there anything that is truly paradoxical? That's your fundamental question. Am I right?
how do you mean?
In terms of what you were just now saying, I wasn't adding anything. I was trying to reformulate it.
Where does the paradoxical come in?
That to be creative seems to be not derivative merely from pre-established laws. Then we would say, oh no, it's not really creative because it's been determined.
Well, no, not so much in that sense. I mean, it would require a little bit of a redefinition of the understanding of creativity, but just because, you know, creativity doesn't actually come out of something external to the physical world doesn't mean that it's anything different. It's just, you know, understanding that at its most fundamental level is that. Now, one of the things I'm thinking along these lines is how it has to do with free will, where the two would sort of seem to be linked, in that if creativity is truly creative in the original sense, then there's some element of free will involved. If there is no free will, there is no, you know, creativity in that sense. And the interesting thing about it is that if you have a totally deterministic universe, and again, this is, I briefly mentioned this last week, if you have a totally deterministic universe, and, you know, the human mind is simply just this sort of big complex calculator, where if you know what's going on with all the elements inside it, you can figure out what it's going to do. You know, does that mean that there's no free will? But the trick to that is that such a system can have a set of beliefs independent of free will. A system can have a belief about things. For example, a thermostat can believe that the temperature in the room is something. It has nothing to do with free will. And if the system that is the human brain or the human mind, if that system actually itself has the belief in free will, it has the belief that it has the capacity to make these decisions, that actually changes the calculus that occurs when that system, you know, calculates what to do next or decides what to do, depending on whether or not it believes that it has the capacity for free will.
But aren't these two different questions? One about the nature of creativity, and second, the question of whether there's free will. Because even if there is free will, there might be a world in which there is no creativity, no real, let's call it true creativity.
That's true, but
And second, even if the world is determined, we could say in some areas of its determination, there is creativity and others not. So maybe the two problems are
but I think
unrelated.
I mean, the way I see it, I think free will is a necessary condition for, I guess, what we'll call true creativity in an original sense, where if there is no free will, then, you know, what would the creativity be coming out of? If you have this true creativity wherein it is something coming in external, from external to the system, then that in itself could be considered a form of free will. And so if there is no free will, there can be no true creativity in that sense.
No, but that's because of the definition you're giving to the word true. In ordinary language, someone might say of Picasso, he really was very creative. Look at all of these different stages and different works that he produced. And someone would say, yes, that really is an example of creativity. But it would apply even whether the world is free or determined. That seems to be a metaphysical question of a different sort. Unless you define true creativity as not being deterministic.
Well, yeah, I mean that's sort of what I'm getting at, is trying to explore. You know, I mean, I don't think this necessarily. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't change the fact that we'll look at something that Picasso did or whatever and say, yes, that's creative. But then the question is that something that simply arose because of the physical nature of his brain at that time in that environment, or did it come from something external to the whole system? And I think again, though, that and I haven't fully worked out this part of my argument yet, but as I argued for the thing of free will, where if the system of the human brain or mind does in fact believe that it has free will, that actually changes what it will do so that it will behave as though it has some sort of free will. I think a similar argument may apply to creativity, where if someone believes, or if a brain or system believes that it is creative, that it has the capacity for creativity, that actually changes what that system will produce, and therein sort of paradoxically creates the creative process out of that.
But somebody might believe that he has no free will, and yet go on and be very creative. What would you say to him? Oh, you're deluding yourself, because you're contradicting yourself, because if you have no free will, then how can you be creative? You're just doing things that come out of you. But to the rest of us, these astonishing things would be what we mean by creativity.
Yes, but those
already determined.
Yeah, they were all predetermined, is what the argument would be. If this free will, if this source of mental things external to physical reality exists, that's one thing. If it doesn't exist, then all of these things follow from physical laws, unless you don't necessarily believe in a deterministic universe, which is a bit more of a problem for physics. Quantum mechanics does open the door to the possibility of a universe that's not deterministic, but again, that's sort of a bit of a physical question.
Could we take a break at this point? I'd like to continue with Eric, and the rest of you. Now we've got 1.5 papers discussed, and I do want to hear from all of you. But could we take a short break, please? All right. Why don't you start?
Okay, where are we?
Tell me how far along the paper is.
It's getting there. I'm still digging through some of my research, but I've got to. I guess my argument's formulating fairly well in my head, and I'm pretty comfortable with where I am. Like I said, the one thing that I'm still just a bit uncertain of is I'm working on tying in the argument that I said about free will and the belief in such thing changing the outcome to the same sort of argument about creativity, where the belief in a capacity for original creativity actually changes the outcome in a deterministic system. And that's the last little bit I'm kind of working through there.
What's the outside research?
I've got a number of things I pulled together here. One of them is Free Will as Creativity. It's from this online philosophy journal.
Does it say any? Oh, it's about creativity. I see.
This one's more about free will and determinism. I mean, I did all these. The way I found them was by searching for free will and creativity. So these all have something to do with creativity.
Okay. You remember that I gave you 2 pages of research material outside, partial lists I sent. I mean, that could be of help depending on what you want to do in your paper. Do you feel comfortable about it?
Yeah.
Okay, and you, Beckett, you are too. You know what you're doing. Tom?
Alright, I'm mostly looking at creative artificial intelligence. So I've got a couple examples of, I'm trying to figure out like what has to be done to create artificial intelligence that is creative.
What about the Minsky's book?
The Emotion Machine.
Pardon? I mean, have you been using that?
I've read it. I don't know.
You have read it all? Gone through it all?
I've read most of it, like the first part of it. I'm not sure how much of it really applies to this. I thought something that was more applicable was a paper by Margaret Bohm, which was talking about like conceptual spaces and how like how that would affect it. I think like the stuff that Minsky did on like neural networks and like randomly wired neural networks is pretty important to it in terms of finding like computers that can like.
That's the paper you mentioned last week.
Right, that's right.
Okay.
And then I also wanted to look at like the program Aaron, which was written by Harold Cohen, and it's like an art making program that it's like I guess like written in Lisp, and it's been given like a lot of public attention for being like this like creative like artificial intelligence. But my argument is that it's not in fact creative, because what it does is it kind of mimics like the art style of Harold Cohen. So in as much as Harold Cohn's, like, his art style would be creative, then I guess it would be. But, like, all it can really do is that one style. Like, there's nothing that it can, like, it can't, like, start, like, a new style or, like, change, like, I guess the conceptual, like, boundaries. That is what is necessary for, like, actual creative acts.
In the book on the definition of creative, I think, isn't that the name of the anthology that Bowden edited? And there's an article of hers in that, in which she distinguishes between the sort of minor and the major kind of creativity. Right. That's the same idea. She develops it further, or have you not looked at that other essay?
What's the name of that essay?
The definition of creativity.
Definition of creativity. I'll read that, I guess.
It's conceivable that I have the library copy, but...
yeah, somebody has most of Bowden's books out of the library. I looked, and all the ones dealing with creativity are not there.
Well, no, there's only one of hers that I have, and that's the book that she edited. But possibly you don't need that essay of hers because it's all in that book of hers that you do have.
Right.
In terms of your concern, Megan, maybe you ought to try to cooperate with Tom, see what he has out.
Well, I was able to find plenty.
You don't need it.
Was specifically looking for those.
Okay. In general, keep in mind what you're learning right now about who has which books out, so that you can talk to each other and share them.
The one like the article I was using was Constructions of the Mind.
By her?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know anything about that.
Okay.
There is somebody whom I learned about this weekend who is a professor at Georgia Institute of Technology, and she has an NEH grant this year and is spending her time at the Radcliffe Institute, and the topic of her project is creativity in science. You might want to, I don't know if there's time for you to even think of getting in touch with her if she's right in her office or anything, but her name is Nancy Nersessian. Well, no, actually, look, why don't you proceed this way? Get on to Google and track down Nancy Nersessian. Mikkel is very good about doing that on the spot, and see if there are any extracts from her writings about creativity and science on the internet. You got her already?
Well, it says her research focuses on human creativity in science. The major theme of this research is conceptual and innovation and change in physics and in physics education, specifically the role of analogical and visual modeling and thought experimenting simulative modeling. Her current research includes investigative reasoning and representational procedures in interdisciplinary research laboratories, and blah, 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 blah.
Does that interest any of you? Okay, then don't worry about it. You have plenty of sources with Bowden's writings. So.
Yeah. One other thing that was interesting to me was I was looking up like alternate means of like creating like creative artificial intelligence, and I came across like the Turing test, which I guess is
Pardon?
Which I guess is like a way of trying to make artificial intelligence that could communicate like with a human, and the human wouldn't be able to tell the difference. So
well, this is just a label, isn't it? Alan Turing didn't come up with this, did he? He was one of the great founding fathers of artificial intelligence, and apparently a very, very brilliant and tragic figure in the 1940s. But he didn't himself have anything to do with the Turing test, wasn't? Did he?
I thought he did.
Oh, he did?
I thought like written it up.
Oh, he's written about it, but he didn't set up the competition.
Well, I guess it's like a hypothetical test. I don't think has it. I don't
I
think
got
it's
it.
actually
Okay.
done.
Yes, it does. It has been
It
done.
has been
All right.
done.
Well, how it's about? How is it related to creativity?
Well, like one of the ideas for like a computer that could be put into it was this one by Ned Block, I think, and it's like the blockhead computer, which is a hypothetical computer which would have like all the possible like opening like statements or like beginning ways of like starting a conversation, and then would also have programmed in it like every like correct grammatical response to that to any statement that like the person would give back to it. So then the idea would be like if it had all of those programmed into it, it could have like a contextually and grammatically correct response to anything that you might say to it. So it would be just like it was a person, like in every way.
So it's basically like Eliza with a very large database?
Right, with like an infinitely large database or something. Because I guess there's like a limited number of possible like statements that you could say. So I was kind of thinking about like whether or not that would be something that would be creative then, because it would act exactly like a person would in the situation, or whether or not that would just be like just the sum of its components.
Anybody want to say anything about this? Well, keep working. You seem to know what you're doing really well. Is there any way you can think that I can be of help?
I think I'm alright.
Is this a good moment to come back to a discussion of the emotion machine of Minsky's? Let me take over for just a few minutes, but I mean, it turns out that I can stay until 5 instead of returning to my emergency. And there should be enough time for everybody. I wrote down a number of questions relevant to the emotion machine that might interest you. The first is, what is it that Minsky is trying to do at all? And the one would be how to construct a humanoid machine, naturally. I mean, everybody in artificial intelligence has that in mind. But second is how to make computers that are sensitive to human feelings. And that's where the work of Rosalind Picard comes in. She's here at the Media Lab, and there's a book of hers, Affective Computing, that deals directly with that, so that you might want to look at that. But third, what interests me most, and which I think Minsky is also interested in, is to show what are the relationship between mind and matter, and meaning by mind, including feelings in what we mean by mind. What is the interaction between the two of them? And out of that, how can affective and cognitive approaches be related to each other? Now, the effort that Minsky makes is very interesting to me because he's obvious. I don't know him very well, though apparently we overlapped in various ways. But I can't say that he's a friend of mine or that I've had a really serious discussion with him. But I find his writing very impressive once he steps back from the official program of what he's doing as one of the founders of artificial intelligence and talks about the world, about life, about the way a moralist would, the way somebody in literature or humanistic philosophy would, the way I try to do, only he does it better from his own point of view and totally ignores what I'm doing, which I'm used to. But what he does seems to me very attractive and indicates that he's a brilliant man. But I don't see the connection with the rest as being established in the way that he hopes. He hopes that by talking about the body, the brain, artificial intelligence on a mechanistic basis, will explain all of these other insights that he has about human nature and about life. And I don't find that. I find these two different compartments in his mind. Maybe that is enough. Maybe that's all that anybody can do nowadays. But that perception is strong in me, and possibly I'm right, possibly I'm wrong. At the beginning of the first chapter, he talks right, throws it in your face. He talks about the nature of love, which doesn't sound very much like artificial intelligence, and quotes, I don't know how many of you noticed this, from Dorothy Parker, who was a very important, not quite a great writer, but a very outstanding writer of the 1920s and 30s, who published in, poems in the New Yorker, and was extremely witty, but in a kind of disillusioned, embittered sort of way. I don't know whether any of you have read anything by her, but the poem that Minsky starts with is characteristic of her. He gives only the first 4 lines, or maybe, I can't remember now, maybe this is the whole poem. And let me read it to you. Oh, life is a glorious cycle of song, a medley of extemporanea, and love is a thing that can never go wrong. And I am Marie of Romania. Marie of Romania was a queen at that point, so the poet is obviously insane. And that explains this gush of enthusiasm about love. Now it's very witty, and Minsky uses it very effectively to make his points about love. They boil down to his saying that by studying, where is it? I guess it's on another, maybe, no, it's on another page, in which he says, throughout this book, what we're going to do is to show how it is that people, given their bodily equipment and their brains, their hardwiring, which would be relevant to the work of artificial intelligence, the making of robots, how they're capable even of having experiences of love, whatever love may be. And he gives a kind of analysis of it, which is not very advanced, and since I've spent so much of my life on this, sort of amateurish, but utterly respectable, and I wouldn't demean his doing what he's done about love. But the point is that what I focus on is the fact that he's offering a mechanistic analysis of the body as a way of explaining something that most people have never thought cannot be explained, that is not reducible merely to physiological or other bodily explorations. In other words, he rejects a Freudian reduction of love to sex, or any statement of it in terms of chemistry or hormones, in order to give his own idea of what he's talking about, and that studying artificial intelligence will help us to understand what brings it about. Okay. In the 3rd chapter, however, he then takes another tack, which is the one that I was talking about last time, that I mentioned today briefly. I will argue that each of our various mental states, so that would include our feelings, is a different pattern of ways to think, and that what we call feelings could be attempts by some parts of a mind to describe some aspects of those conditions. Now that's a contradiction, I think, to the first view, and he fluctuates back and forth. And that, I think, is a problem with much of what he has to say. Let's go back now to Tom, if he wants, or if you've exhausted your ideas. I mean, if you have said as much as about your use of artificial intelligence as you want to, we can go further. Do you want to go? You don't want. You don't feel any need.
Yeah, I think.
All right. With all of you, please read carefully the paragraph at the bottom of the syllabus. Right. Amy?
I read from the related resources, The Nature of Creativity by Sternberg. It's a collection of essays. And I talked about last week, I'm going to talk about the investment theory of creativity, which asserts that creative thinkers are like good investors who buy low and sell high, and basically want to generate ideas
Okay,
that are
that's what you mentioned last time. Have you progressed further?
Yeah, and so basically what I'm going to do is they divide up creativity, like make an effort to define it into different categories. Those being, in terms of creative leadership.
Say them more
They're
slowly
dividing,
at the crucial points.
they're dividing different types of creativity into different categories.
Those being, go ahead.
Right, those being leadership that accepts existing ways of doing
Leadership
things.
that
Accepts existing ways of doing things, which could include replication, redefinition, and then they talk about incrementation, either trying to advance an existing idea a little bit or trying to advance an existing idea.
right. That sounds
by a great
like
amount.
the second of Bowden's categories,
Oh, really?
where if it's creative, it's at a lesser level or to a lesser degree. In that chapter that's called The Definition of Creativity that I mentioned, she contrasts Mozart and Beethoven and Haydn in that respect, that what Haydn does is creative, but within limits set by the musical tradition, what we call classical music, which he was one of the founders of, but that he had somehow, to a large extent, to some degree, had inherited from the way music was being done at that time in the early 18th century. That's to be contrasted with Mozart, who digests all of that, but then he does these very different, basically extensively different kinds of uses of the accepted rules. And as I think I mentioned in the first class of the course, I myself would then contrast Mozart with Beethoven, because Mozart was a great genius who knew how to invent. He, in a sense, one might even, I don't know if this is going to make much sense, but let's try it out, that Mozart was not creative in his genius so much as inventive, that he would invent new melodies. He would turn on the faucet and out would come all of these different possibilities, but that they were not based on some fundamental construction of new rules for doing music, or new forms of music. Whereas Beethoven was creative in that respect, that he did invent those new ways of doing things. He experimented with them, and when he did them, people thought they were very strange and wild. I was reading a biography of Mendelssohn, who was himself a genius, and whose father was a great lover of music and very, very knowledgeable. And the father didn't think much of Beethoven. This would be in the early 19th century, maybe a couple of decades after Beethoven died. And he said, all this, the last quartets, they're just sort of formless and wild and unprincipled, and he didn't think much of Beethoven. The truth is that Beethoven was experimenting with new forms in such an original way that many people couldn't quite even practice, sympathetic musicians couldn't understand what he was doing. Well, that would be a different mode of creativity. So you would have, if you want to explore this, let's go back to the Bowden chapter. But from Tom, I gather maybe you don't have to go there. Anything of Bohn's will give you the same. Explore these as three different possibilities. Okay, that's all under the first category. Now go on.
Yeah, so I was going to say the second category is creativity that challenges existing ways of doing things, or if you think about it, more of inventiveness as opposed to...
Well, the word, again, yeah, now we're getting into the terminological problem about what the word inventiveness means as opposed to creativity. Kessler distinguishes between creativity and inventiveness, too. Also, what you're saying about the second category seems to be the definition that Kessler gives for all creativity, that all creativity is a reaction against established ways of doing things, that the creativity consists in that bisociation, you remember, that Kessler talks about, where you take two separated methods of thinking and of imagination, and you combine them two. You unite them in a way that nobody else has done. So that would seem to fit the second category.
Yeah, I guess that Sternberg is more saying that a crowd-defying type of creativity might be something that's reconstructed from a point in the past, but might not be something that's used in the present. And one of the examples that he brings up is the Clinton administration trying to achieve a balanced budget, which, although it might not seem creative, was something that hadn't been done in a long time. And basically, he's arguing that that is, in a sense, creative because they were able to redirect basically the direction of the financial state.
Is this the third category?
No, it's under saying that this is like a crowd-defying type of creativity. And he's just trying to use a lot of different examples. Sternberg talks about businesses, he talks about product design, he talks about the government. So he's just trying to say that basically they were a new, their administration was using a new type, their leadership was exemplifying a new type of creativity since they went back to the era of actually making a balanced budget. And
that isn't what, after all, I maybe have misunderstood what you're saying. That isn't what Kessler had in mind. This is a redirection, whereas Kessler's idea is that it's a kind of radical, logically radical way of combining what everyone else would have thought would be irreconcilable differences, opposites.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was going to say Sternberg's third idea is synthesis, and that would be more
Is that,
what Kessler said.
that would be what?
That would be more like what Kessler was saying.
Is there a category for that?
Yeah, his third category is synthesis, and that's the one that's least described, obviously.
But a synthesis among what seem to be irreconcilable opposites. Not just a synthesis, but that particular one. Otherwise, everyone would have thought about it, but because the components seem to be irreconcilable, the synthesis is creative. Okay. Now, do you want to go through all of them, or?
There should probably be enough time. I don't know if other people want to go.
And you're in control. I mean, you don't have any problems with the writing of the paper.
I think I'm okay.
So is there any way that we could be of help?
I think I'm okay.
Okay. Mikhail?
All right. So.
Hi.
So, as I stated before last week, I will be writing about creativity and intelligence and what role creativity plays in the development of intelligence and how that leads to creative intellectuals. And so, what I'm basing a lot of this on previous research that I've done in the past and how the mind develops, especially in infants and adulthood. And so, one of my claims, which is actually, I would say the most important claim that I make, is that creativity is a native function to all humans. And that in order for any type of intellectual development to take place, creativity must be an innate ability of our mind. And the reason I say this is because it is defined by James Russell Lowell that creativity is not the finding of a thing, but the making something out of it after it is found. And so from that, I'm going to use that definition as the basis for the creating of new concepts that a person will go through throughout life, making sense of the world from his or her experiences.
Let me interrupt you. Lowell was a poet, and it's a poetic statement. I don't know exactly what it means, and I don't have to, and you don't have to, but putting too much weight on it.
Well, no, that's not what I was basing it off of. I found that, actually, I just found that earlier today that actually supports what I was saying.
Okay, that's fine.
But also, I was going, like I said, I was using creativity as an innate ability of all human beings, and it's from this innate ability we're able to conceptualize and thus form our mental cognition. And I have some sources, and also I've known this from past research, is that seems to be the case that more intellectual people tend to be more creative than, well, let me phrase that. Above average intellect persons tend to be more creative than average intellect persons. Now, I'm still digging into what that's based off of, but there is a correlation between creativity and intelligence. And so from that, I deduced that creativity is, as stated, an innate ability such as language and can be practiced. And from that, I deduced that everyone has the potential to be a genius because as life goes on, you keep practicing this creative process and creating new concepts. And so from that, I argue that the disparity between intellectuals and non-intellectuals is not the basis of genetics, but more of nurturing, because that creative process has not been nurtured as much as someone else who has a higher IQ. So I would say that a person, let's say you have two children, for example, two children in a neighborhood, and at the age of 8, they're roughly the same intelligence, but one grows up to be a professor and the other grows up to be a manager of McDonald's. And I would argue that the reason why this one grew up into being a professor is because he had more practice in creating new concepts. He was exposed to more things that forced him, in order to make sense of the world, to be more creative than the person who was a manager at McDonald's. And so from that, I go into one of the main questions that has bothered me for a long time is, why is there such a disparity between geniuses and mentally retarded people? And the reason I ask this is because if what I'm saying is true, such that creativity is an innate ability that can be practiced and strengthened, just as language or any other ability, or kinesthetic intelligence, it can be strengthened with practice and repetition, why is it that for mentally retarded persons, that even with extensive practice and repetition, it is still, the process of creating new concepts is still slow, it is still delayed, and they never seem to be able to reach that level of even average intellect. And so that's what I'm going into.
Well, the point, are you starting out with the premise that it is innate in the sense that it's innate to the human race and everybody is equally endowed?
That's part of my argument. See, I would say with the exceptions of born geniuses and mentally retarded people, I would say yes.
Okay. Now, how do you explain those two kinds of exceptions?
That's what I'm researching right now.
Also, if, as we know in many areas, there are talents, aptitudes
I talk about that as well.
that come from the genes. That's what I mean.
Well, see,
why wouldn't the creativity also be limited by the genes that we inherit?
That's true, but at the same time, I may be genetically predisposed. I may be genetically disposed or predisposed. What is that?
Predisposed, yeah.
There we go. I may be genetically predisposed to have a knack for physics, but that does not mean that I cannot develop other mental faculties to that same level.
No, wait a minute. A knack is what you're predisposed toward.
Hmm. That's genetic. Genetically.
What? Now, what is that knack?
Now, I mean, genetically, I'm predisposed to have a gift in physics.
No, but that's, I mean, what goes into that? Why? I mean, that seems very high level. If you choose physics, what do you have to be in order to be a physicist? Why? No, make it a little easier, or more obvious. Let's say that you have a knack to be a pianist.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what does that mean?
Means I would interpret that as genetically you have the qualities and abilities in order such that the act of playing the piano is more natural for you than that of another
Now, would that be true of everybody?
No, but what I'm saying is because of this innate ability to create new concepts, that everyone, given sufficient repetition and work, can work up to that level.
Everyone could?
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
You're putting creativity as an independent sort of function of the brain as
Yes.
opposed to learning or...
There is in every area of life that innate potentiality?
I would say yes. 'Cause I would say that there is no mental limit to what a person is capable of doing. I mean, I would say that the reason, like, I play the saxophone, the reason why I would never ever be as great as, say, Charlie Parker is because I don't play as much as he does. Charlie Parker played from every waking moment of his life, from the time he woke up to the time he went to sleep, unless he was doing drugs, but all the time he was playing. As with I played maybe an hour a week or two. So because if I were to play that intensely as Charlie Parker, I do not feel that there's any reason why I would not be able to get to that level.
I wouldn't question that for a moment about you because I don't know. But I can't believe that that would be true of everybody, that if only somebody in the population were picked up and forced or encouraged, and who liked even, to play as much as Charlie Parker did, that he would ever play as well.
So, in that sense...
That's like the monkeys being put into the typewriter and ending up with the works of Shakespeare. I mean, it has to be more than just this application of the seat of the pants to the seat of the chair.
That actually gives me a good argument for why it's genetic as well. How well you're able to create these new...
The concept.
Yes.
What's the concept?
I would say these concepts of these practices, these abilities.
Oh, they're different from concepts. Your ability to be creative in these abilities, right?
Well, when I say creative, I'm not strictly speaking about the arts. I'm speaking about like everyday life and particularly intelligence, the different faculties of intelligence. So it's just like some people, I would argue that everyone has the ability to create innately. But I would say that for some people, that ability is stronger than others. And there lies that disparity between those strengths is the disparity between genius and mentally retarded.
But it seems like a truism if all you're saying is to some degree, however slight, everybody can be creative. Because that's sort of innocuous, you could say that, because it doesn't matter. He has a little ability, but he isn't a creative person because that amount is so small.
No, I would say...
The interesting question would be if everybody has a comparable ability.
I would say everyone of average intellect has a comparable ability because it requires, based on my claim that creativity is required for intellectual development, in order to get to a point of being able to live in this world, self-sustained, you have to have a certain level of intelligence. And from that creativity you are born with, you create the concepts required, or create abilities or intelligence, whatever faculty of life required in order to live your life, at the bare minimum.
It does. Well, I think I understand what you're saying, but it seems strange to treat the great geniuses of this world in any field as sort of being on the same level or on a par with ordinary mortals like most of us. You know, when I think of people like Johann Sebastian Bach or Immanuel Kant or Wittgenstein or any number of great philosophers, or people like Picasso, there's something more. Their genius sort of exceeds anything I could ever approximate. I stand in awe of them, and it's not because I don't want to be one of them or apply myself. It's because there's something in their powers of perception, something in maybe the genes, something in their very unique lifestyle that I can't approximate, no matter if any more than I could run a 4 mile, the mile in 4 minutes. It's simply not in my repertoire. I'm not programmed for that to be a possibility. So it is the idea of dragging them down to my level seems very questionable.
I'm not dragging them down. It's those people those are the anomalies. And that's what I'm trying to explain. The geniuses and the mentally retarded. Those are the anomalies to that innate ability that we all share.
But I also don't think that we have, it's not clear to me that the difference between me and Picasso is one that's actually objective. I think it's much fuzzier than that. So it depends a lot on how much weight you put on, for example, whether Picasso actually deserves credit for it or whether it was simply his environment that produced it. Those sorts of questions, I think, undermine the guaranteed value of that kind of differentiation in an argument. So I wouldn't say that it's clear how different Picasso is from me on some clear standard. I think he's done very different things than me, but it's not. I don't feel like you can say he's just simply qualitatively different from me based on on this well-reasoned argument, because we have no way of actually measuring that outside of the social values and culture that we bring to the exercise. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm guessing not. Basically, I'm having a hard time believing that we can say whether creativity is democratic in distribution or whether it has some elite or non-flat distribution to it on any rational basis, because so much of our discussion of what creativity is and how we value it is not rational. So there's something else going on here that needs to be discussed if we're going to try and say that geniuses are qualitatively different than average.
One thing you can say, which all of the totalitarian countries have capitalized on, is that if you sort of regiment large enough members of the population to be pole vaulters or athletes or musicians or anything, you're going out of that, there will come a few geniuses who would otherwise not have been noticed. I mean, that was the reason why the Soviet Union continued for 70 years. Everybody, as I mentioned, knew it was a bad system, that it wouldn't work, but everybody was equally encouraged, and so they had these masses of young people marching together and doing athletics together, and a few of them really were geniuses, and that seemed to compensate for all the failures of the system. In democratic worlds, things are less well organized. But the fact remains that it isn't just a question of nurturing, and it isn't some innate ability that we know about, but you know, just encouraging people to think they're all creative doesn't make them all creative. Only there's still going to be that handful who really stand out. And those are the geniuses, or near geniuses, and the question is how to explain them. But maybe you'll do that in the paper, I don't know.
Okay.
Can any of us help? Harold? No, Harold, go ahead.
I was wondering how you deal with the cases of like autistic savants.
Yeah, I was actually just researching him today. Haven't really dived into that just yet. So that's definitely to be considered. I really don't know what to think of that just yet.
Yeah, because my mom's a neurologist and she's worked with kids who are, you know, you can't communicate with them, but they could, you know, draw these amazing paintings and, you know, do all this, you know, perform great pieces. I'm not sure they can, actually I think they do construct their own pieces, some of them do, so that is creative. Like playing someone else's piece may not be considered creative, but I mean it depends where you're going with the argument in your paper. So.
Another just quick question. Is your argument that there's sort of a Gaussian distribution and that everything in the middle is kind of interchangeable, and then once you get out, like, say, 2 standard deviations, there's this weird inflection point? Or is it that, like, you know, basically most people are in the middle, and there's a little spike out at one end, and a little spike out at that end, and there's nothing really in between
More
those?
of a Gaussian distribution.
Of course, I mean, that was the whole thing I was sort of trying to undermine, but that you can even put it in a distribution.
I don't see why not, though.
I don't see how. So if you have a Gaussian distribution, then, and you want it to mean something, then you need to have some objective meaning attached to the variable that your distribution is over. Otherwise, I mean, then it might mean something to you because it's subjective, you know, and say, well, this is how creative people are. But it's not going to mean much to everybody else because they don't know, they can't hold your meaning of creativity. So that's what I think the challenge I would pose is.
Well, I think, I don't know if I made this clear or not, but when I say people are creative, I mean that, in a sense, we are all creative. Like, we had to be creative in order to get where we are today. In order, when we experience a new concept, or when we experience an event in the world, we must create a concept that makes sense of that experience. And that's what I'm saying. In that sense, we are all creative. But then there are these anomalies, those 2 standard deviations to the right or left, where this ability seems to be overdeveloped. Either overdeveloped or underdeveloped. That's by the nurture or by nature. Genetically, they just have this ability that is far superior than that of the average person.
At the Pickhour inaugural, there was some discussion about nature and nurture that came from questions from the floor. And in the panel of the 5 Nobel laureates, they all agreed that that's not an interesting scientific question anymore. Before, people used to think in terms of these alternatives, but what we've learned is that it's all a combination of both. I don't know if that's of any help to you.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to go into. It's definitely a combination of both.
All right, so if that's true, then what the job for the creative thinker in science and about the life in general would be just how do the two enter in? Just how in clear cases does one find the effect of both of them and they're responding to each other in some kind of ricochet? I think that would be very useful. In writing your papers I think in philosophy in general, but in something as obscure as the topic of this course, try very, very hard to focus on clear cases and analyze them in terms of something, details that you can clarify, rather than feeling any need to create a grand new metaphysics of any sort, or even a solution to whatever problem you're concerned about. It's the analysis, it's the focusing upon details within a complicated system as a way of revealing their importance for each other. That I think is crucial. I say that for this paper because that's what's hardest for people at the beginning of their philosophical training to realize, that that's really what matters. But as a matter of fact, I myself believe that, for me at least, that's the best way to do philosophy. It's the only way I can do philosophy. Otherwise, I find that the generalizations are platitudes and that I'm not creative. If I have any creativity myself, it's by having perceptions that other people don't, and then the ability to reveal the content of those perceptions and show how they're relevant to whatever it is I'm trying to explain. But it doesn't matter about me. I think that's advice I'd offer to all of you for the writing of papers. Thomas?
Okay, so I was initially going to write on the necessity of creativity, but when I was doing my research, I couldn't really find anything on it. I actually switched to creativity versus intelligence. And I also used a lot of Sternberg's work. And basically what I'm going to look at is looking at kind of the definitions of creativity and intelligence and see whether you can actually have one without the other. So can you be creative but not necessarily always deemed to be as intelligent by, like, say, the standard tests or whatever. What I've found is that a lot of people argue that creativity is actually a subset of intelligence, and that
Actually what?
a subset of intelligence, and that without intelligence you can't have creativity.
How much intelligence?
Well, see, that's the thing. It's what kind of intelligence are you talking about? So are you talking about the kind of intelligence which is proven by your standard IQ test? So someone is seen to be or deemed to be intelligent because they're able to pass X, Y, Z, like with amazingly good results compared to the average person. Or something which I think has cropped up once or twice in class is what we call your everyday common sense. And is that more intelligent because you're taking a problem and you're seeing, like, you know, you're looking in it in a practical way and actually being able to solve it.
And that is, but that isn't prerequisite for all creativity.
Or maybe, or maybe not.
Excuse me, what?
Maybe or maybe not. Like, that's what I'm trying to decide.
Because very often the people we think of as creative, particularly the geniuses, don't have good common sense.
Exactly, but
because they don't live in that domain. It doesn't matter to them.
yeah, but then can you actually say then that they're really that intelligent? Because, okay, so a story
for their purposes, they might not be as good.
But, like, okay, so a story, Sternberg and Lubert, I think, in a book which they both wrote together called Defying the Crowd, they talk about these two boys, and they're in the woods, and there's this bear that's running after them. And then he says, well, to make this story to make more sense, you need to understand the background of these two boys. Now, one of these boys is really, really intelligent. Like, he's got really high marks in all his, like, IQ tests. He's got really good commendations from teachers, and his parents think he's intelligent. And, like, with a lot of arrogance, he kind of says, well, and the boy pretty much thinks he's pretty intelligent too. But then there's this other kid there, and he doesn't have such good grades or whatever, and he doesn't have as good commendations, and he's not deemed to be as intelligent. But they're both in these woods, and there's this grizzly bear, really angry. He's running after them, and the intelligent boy is able to stand there and calculate the speed at which the bear is, the speed at which, like, the bear is, like, running towards them, and realizes there's something like 17 seconds before the bear is going to get to them. But there's no way that they're going to be able to run away because there's too short a time for both of them to get away. And the story goes that the other boy in the meantime, is busy changing from his hiking shoes to his jogging shoes. And the intelligent boy kind of looks at this like other guy and he's like, what are you doing? We're never going to get away. And the other guy says, well, yeah, but that doesn't really matter because all that matters is that I get further away than you. So is it really that this intelligent boy was really that intelligent? Because he clearly can't have been that intelligent, because maybe it would have been better, instead of him sitting there and calculating the speed at which this bear was going to get to them, if he thought of a better way of actually being able to get away. Whereas obviously this so-called not-so-intelligent guy actually, did manage to run to safety because the other guy got killed because the bear got him first. But do you see? So there is that kind of this kind of really blurry line between what you can say is like really intelligent or what is really creative, because in that kind of situation, you would say that the second boy, the technically not so intelligent boy, was actually far more intelligent. Or was it? Yeah. Okay, so another thing that I've come up with. So the first, so I've almost finished my paper, but the first thing I kind of set about doing, which I don't think I did very well in my first essay, was to try and define creativity and try and define what is meant by intelligence. And I found like 1 or 2 models that other people have come up with, and I discussed those a bit. And something that's come up in the definition of what is considered creative is not that it's just novel, but like you said, is whether it's actually appropriate or not.
Whether it's what?
Appropriate.
Appropriate.
So something might be creative, but just not deemed socially appropriate. And an example which Sternberg actually gives is the artist Damien Hirst. I don't know if you guys have heard of him. He basically, it's one of his pieces of art. He cut up animals into fragments and put them on display, and that's what he called art. And I mean, it received a lot of criticism because a lot of people said, well, obviously that's not art, that's just complete butchery. But can you not, I mean, you... But
explain this to me. He would kill animals and then rearrange the parts?
No, he literally, like you would get them in like a slicing machine, basically. You literally slice the animal. Yeah, that guy. He he's literally like sliced the animal into pieces, and he didn't rearrange them, but he put these pieces in like preservatives and stuff, and he put them in like double-sided glass cabinets, whatever. So you can see like either side of basically like all the different organs and where they would be, etc., exactly as it would be in the live animal. And it was called art. But that's exactly what people said. They said it was cruel, right? Because like, cool. Well, you could say it's cool, but it's. I mean, a lot of people said, well, is it complete butchery or whatever? And
I hadn't heard of that.
But if you, I think he was an English artist.
This guy. I'm sorry, just to throw in. An athlete had died and donated his body to him, and
Damien Hirst.
I guess I don't remember the names. But what he did, the artist guy skinned his body.
You said an athlete first time.
Yeah, an athlete. After he died, he donated his body
to the artist. Right.
To the artist. The artist skinned his body, and what he did is that he peeled back all the muscles, and peeled so you could see the different layers of muscles, and then they put him on display where he's running like this, but you could see all of his muscles peeled back. And you can see all the entire muscular structure of the body.
That's
I actually thought that was pretty cool.
That's another guy here.
And he displayed it. I mean, that was his work of art.
So that
on the irony that they're becoming more popular.
Yeah, it was called I actually saw that exhibition. It was called Body Worlds.
What was his name?
Dr. Gunther Hunter, I think, or something like it's Gunther. Look for Body Worlds. That was the name of the exhibition. It was really, really popular. I don't know whether it was just popular in England, but I think it went touring around Europe as well. He actually also did something really controversial. Yeah, that's the one. Where he did a live dissection of a human being. And it was all...
Okay.
Do you remember hearing about that?
I saw that, yeah.
Yeah.
Come to the point.
Okay, sorry. So again, it's the idea of whether you can say... Admittedly, it's not socially appropriate. But does that detract from it being creative? Because part of the definition of creative is that it's novel. So it's the use of maybe ordinary tools in a different way. So is that saying is it really fair to say objectively that what these people did is actually not creative just because we deem it socially unacceptable? Do you see? So I mean, there's that kind of fine. I mean, that's another bit of the discussion I go into when I go into kind of trying to define creativity, and then the idea is basically I have the definition of creativity, and like there are different models for intelligence, and trying to see how interrelated the two are and whether you can have one without the other.
Well, I would have thought in this case the socially inappropriate would be less important than the question of what he actually did with the material that he was presenting. Artists, Michelangelo, for instance, used to go to study cadavers in order to learn about the muscles and the structure of the anatomy. Now, one might say that this artist was doing something comparable. Doesn't yet prove to us that he's very creative. He might have been a showman who was charging money, and there's nothing creative unless there was a way in which he presented it under the circumstances of this being an art gallery or something like that. That might make it creative.
Yeah, so this guy who did the Body Worlds exhibition, I mean, it was very, very controversial at the time, but very popular, like everyone was running to see it. And he actually managed to get all the bodies he put on display because he went through and got a grant and basically said he was trying to teach science. And the idea was that basically he was putting out all this anatomy, and he developed a very interesting system where you could preserve like body material using some sort of plastic which you can inject into material or whatever. So he had these really amazing displays where he'd injected a dye, and it had gone into every single blood vessel and then dissolved away all the tissue, the bone, the muscle and everything, and all you had left standing was all the veins and arteries and everything, and that's all you had. But it was amazing, it was absolutely amazing. And that was what he put on display. But it wasn't supposed to be some sort of freak show, which it really turned out to be, or however it perceived it, but it was supposed to kind of be a kind of science and art merging and teaching you about science and that kind of letting you see how everything's interrelated and that kind of thing. So, I mean, there was
let me see if there's time
it's
for Harold and Megan. We never got to you. Can we stay a little longer? Not much. Okay. Taz, do you mind if we move on?
No, that's...
Harold?
Actually, it's 35 of 5.
Yeah. It's 35 of 5?
No, it's 5 of 5.
5 after?
Yeah.
Or 5 2?
5 after.
All right. Then why do... And you've got to leave? Or you're thinking of the filming?
No. I have to go in a little bit.
No, just tell me in 30 seconds
Yeah.
what state your paper is in.
Okay, I've been looking for other sources to read about. The idea was to do creativity in software development, and I started thinking about relating it to writing a poem. I was talking about that, and I also started thinking about how software engineers tend to not do other forms of art generally. Like you think of them as like a software dork type person. A software nerd, and then they don't usually do like the painting and stuff like that. So very, very few people actually do both. I wanted to evaluate why that was. If programming is creative, why don't they engage in the standard classical creative acts?
Are you in any danger? Are you in control of the material?
Yeah.
And you've written it and got it going?
Yeah.
All right, so you'll get it in on time and be satisfied.
Yeah, hope so.
All right. Megan, the same with you?
I'm writing partially on what I talked about last week, which is creativity in everyday life, mostly in an attempt, in my research, I find there's two different ways of looking at creativity. There's the artistic sort that refers to what we talk about most in this class, and then creativity in like the kid that's putting his toys away and wants to put the block on the top shelf and finds a way to do it without any help, even though, his little brother or his older brother learned to do the same thing. It's still creative because the kid didn't know that, And we don't discuss that kind of creativity much in this class. So sort of an attempt to link together the two different kinds of creativity. And then second part of my paper is going to be on creativity and intuition. I found two different definitions of intuition that support the two different definitions of creativity, but in both senses, intuition is directly linked to creativity. And
Okay.
so,
Well, particularly for you two, if you send me emails at any point, I mean, right immediately or tomorrow, I'll try to help you further. And in fact, that's true of all of you. Don't despair of getting my help up to the very last minute. Good night.